Good afternoon. Uh, the second brutal wave of the pandemic in India has brought us face to face with tragedies and horrors that we probably never even encountered in the most fearsome of our nightmares. The intensity and surge in numbers is one thing, but what has left us most anguished and horrified is the unpreparedness of our governance, the dire straits of an eternally neglected public healthcare system, and the consequent stripping of dignity and rights of citizens in life, illness, and even death. Even as we live this dystopian reality, we are constantly battling another huge fight, the fight for information, evidence, and clarity on things that could literally make the difference between life and death for an ordinary citizen. Even at Citizen Matters, we find our family members, our friends, our readers grappling with the lack of authentic information and explanations on various facets of the disease, its treatment, and most importantly, the current vaccination policy. The vacillations of the center and its mixed messaging, the absolute cacophony on social media have been least helpful. And therefore, we decided to take some of the most common questions that we get to one of the most trusted, nonpartisan, and knowledgeable figures in this space today, Dr. Anant Pan. Dr. Anant Pan is a researcher in global health, bioethics, and health policy. He's based in Bhopal. Thank you, Dr. Pan, for joining us and making time in what must be an extremely busy schedule for you. So without further ado, I'm just going to plunge directly into the questions we have. I begin with one of the most basic questions that we get from almost everyone we talk to. And that's on the phasing between the two doses of the Covishield vaccine. If you could tell us how you view the successive changes in policy regarding that, and what is the rationale or evidence for suddenly extending the second dose to beyond 12 weeks?
Sure. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this discussion. So I think this whole issue of the increase in the dosing gap for Covishield is an interesting development given where we are right now in India, with the fact that obviously there is a lot of interest in getting vaccinated among many people, especially now with the age relaxation kicking in. But there aren't probably enough vaccines available. There is a shortage of vaccines. So in part, I think this is certainly a pragmatic decision because it helps save vaccines or reduce the number of vaccines doses which might be immediately required for the short term. Now, the evidence behind it sort of draws on from studies done, especially in the UK, but also their real-world utility and usage again in the United Kingdom primarily because Covishield is largely being used either in its AstraZeneca form or as Covishield, which is a licensed version from Serum Institute in India and UK, and to some extent, but not the majority usage in a few other countries. So the evidence from clinical studies which have been published shows that an increased dose gap of around 12 weeks does enhance efficacy of the vaccine. But this information has been known for a while. In India, the decision was taken to keep the dosing gap, as you know, relatively lesser, not as high as 12 weeks, but now in light of the evidence being there from the clinical studies, what they've seen from real world usage in UK rollout, the expert group decided that they wanted to enhance the dosing gap. Now, what is not so well known is this gap of 12 to 16 weeks, whether it is grounded in a particular study, because around 12 weeks is what we've seen in the reported data. But there's enough evidence to indicate that 12 to 16 weeks should be okay. So I'm not very perturbed by this increase if it helps us enhance the number of people who get the first dose, because that is also a strategy used by say Canada, which did this whole effort around first dose fast so that more people get the first dose, because we know even with the first dose there is a relatively high degree of efficacy and that can help enhance the protection for a large number of our population if we are able to roll out the first dose fast. Now the challenge is going to be there are a lot of people who receive their doses with the less
At
gap
6 or 8
between the two,
weeks,
and then
yes.
they are concerned whether this means that they might not be protected, or is the vaccine still going to be efficacious for me? And I think they should not worry. Even with the lesser dosing gap, the efficacy would be still fairly good. And in fact, for people who might have been at risk, especially those who are elderly or with comorbidity, it's good for them to have gotten the 2 doses already. So overall, I don't think we should worry too much about this increased dosing gap. You would still the vaccine would still be efficacious. But what is, I think, certainly important is for India to collect its own data and analyze its own data, so that we
Right.
can draw inferences from our own experiences, see how things are panning out, how many breakthrough infections, etc. How many breakthrough infections, meaning those who have already gotten vaccines are still infected with COVID-19. So that kind of
Right.
analysis, I think, will help us also, because there have been some concerns around new variants and whether the vaccines would protect against them. So far, the evidence seems to be yes, they protect, but of course, we need to look at the data closely to better understand.
Right. So we are also hearing, different recommendations for people who have actually suffered COVID, who may have just recovered or recovered a few weeks back. What does the science say on that at present? How much do we know?
Yeah, so a lot of, I think the Indian guidelines say around 4 to 8 weeks. For example, if you've gotten a dose and then you get COVID-19, that you should perhaps wait for 4 to 8 weeks for your second dose.
Mhm.
The WHO guidance is somewhere around 6 months, from what I remember. And I think the evidence does indicate that if you have been exposed to the virus, there is some degree of protective efficacy. Now, remember, a lot of people also have been reinfected.
Right.
People who got the infection last year also have again gotten an infection after
Mhm.
a few months. But it's likely that there is some degree of protection by virtue of being infected, which lasts for a while. Now, how long that duration lasts is still being researched, and I guess it will also depend on what you were exposed to, variant differences, etc. So I think for a short while, I think it's certainly okay. So 4 to 8 weeks seems fine, but up to 6 months is also certainly, I think, a fair period where people would be protected by virtue of
Mhm.
their prior exposure. Though, of course, there is no 100% guarantee of anything. So it's extremely important for people to follow the precautions around mask usage, distance to the extent possible, and hygiene measures, and especially so the mask usage. I think that's certainly now enough evidence globally that good
Right.
quality mask usage does
Right.
reduce your risk of being infected, and it's as good as a vaccine, or perhaps even more efficacious in some situations.
So speaking of the efficacy, the continuing efficacy of the vaccine, so shortage is a stark reality today. We can't look away from it in the country, and it does seem increasingly possible that many due for their second doses, even with an extended period, especially frontline workers who were among the first to receive, may not receive them on schedule, or even senior citizens, the 60 plus category. So a lot of them are very worried. What happens if the recommended period between the two doses has lapsed? Does it diminish protection? If someone is like beyond 12 weeks, are they back to, spot one?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think a valid concern to have. One is hopeful that the vaccine scarcity relative that we're seeing now will be addressed, and I think the government has announced some intent to prioritize the second doses, especially for those who might be at higher risk. That having been said, even if you miss your second dose because there is no vaccine available when you land up after taking an appointment, I don't think people should get too worried.
Mhm.
Protection does last for longer. What we
Right.
know is from clinical studies, but the real world effectiveness probably is also for a longer period, especially if you're taking precautions. So, they can keep trying, and as and when they get the vaccine, it should be okay. So they shouldn't get too worried about the fact that they were not able to receive it immediately at 12 weeks.
Right.
A couple of extra weeks, maybe a couple of extra months will also be okay. I think where we might start seeing some waning is too large a gap. So anywhere between, like if you have already finished a year after your first dose, then perhaps there is a cause for
That's
worry, and you might have to repeat things. But for most people, it should be okay, and as long as they receive it, in the near future beyond their scheduled second dose, I think they should be fine. So they don't need to worry about it too much.
Another thing that we've been seeing is that, several fully vaccinated individuals, people who have already had their second shot, are also reporting positive results and sometimes days beyond their second shot. So there are people for whom this is leading to, some kind of hesitancy, though I know that hesitancy is not our primary challenge right now. But there are people who are saying, oh, what's the point then? So, what do you think could explain this lapse in vaccine protection for people who have already taken their second dose but are getting infected?
Yeah, so one thing to remember is that none of our vaccines is 100% efficacious, which means that it's not going to protect everyone from disease. Even if you get the vaccine, some of people, especially if they're exposed to infection, could potentially get COVID-19. But that having been said, those who are getting vaccinated have a much higher likelihood of just having mild disease and not progressing to severe disease or dying from COVID-19. There is now, again, a lot of evidence towards this from multiple studies done across the world. So if you get vaccinated, there is a small chance you might still be infected, especially if you have exposure to the infection. But the likelihood that you will have a mild version of the disease is very high. So for those who are hesitating or who are concerned about hearing from others that certain people have gotten the infection even after being vaccinated, even after 2 doses, even after some gap after
Mm-hmm.
the second dose, we'll need to remember that the vaccines are not, have a certain efficacy level somewhere around 70%, 70-80% range. And so there will be still the possibility of people still getting infection after COVID-19 vaccination. But what is more important is that they are protected against a severe form of disease, and hence that by itself is a good enough reason to go ahead and get vaccinated. But also remembering that by ensuring that you also follow the precautions which we all know of by heart by now, you are enhancing the possibility of reducing the chance that you will get the infection. So ensure that you keep using masks. Ensure that unless really required, you don't go out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
So you will reduce the chances of being exposed to the virus and hence getting the infection.
We have seen some alarming photos of overcrowded vaccination centers, and we've also heard people saying that they had to queue up for hours and then maybe, only to find stocks depleted by the time their turn came. So, given the current stocks that states have, and given the infrastructural constraints that most of our health institutions have, public healthcare institutions, how do you think this can be prevented? Because we don't have a centralized, most cities don't have a centralized system where they know how, where, and how to how the vaccine may be got. So, what would be a safe strategy to administer vaccines at this point?
Yeah, you certainly don't want overcrowding at any facility, and especially so also at a vaccine facility, especially, a lot of people waiting in line for a long time and then being told, no, it's not going to be available. So I think we certainly need to bring in efficiency to that. The fact that there were appointment slots designed to try to prevent this was one way out, but the challenge, I guess, is that a lot of people thought that walk-ins might be available. There was walk-ins available earlier, and so there might be some confusion. You could stick to the appointment system, but I think what that might bias against are folks who don't have access to technology,
Right,
who
right.
might not, and so you also need to factor in ways for those who might not have a laptop or a desktop or a smartphone to be able to get a booking. Perhaps the role of frontline health workers becomes important. So local link workers, ASHAs, ANMs, local community volunteers can help set up an appointment. But what will also lessen trust in the system is if they land up with an appointment and they don't get a vaccine. So, ensuring that you link appointments to availability of vaccines and also communicate at the same time. I think now almost everyone knows that there is a shortage of vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
And people would be accepting of that if you have a clear roadmap in mind and tell them that we're taking it slow because we have a shortage now. We're working on trying to expand our basket of vaccines as well as the number of vaccines which are available. But in the short term, this is how we're going to address it. We're going to prioritize, say, the second doses for those who are already due, or we're going to only have limited batches available. This is how you can register for those if you're eligible. So I think that kind of clarity, if it is communicated, people might be patient and wait for a bit longer. I think there was a lot of rush for vaccination, probably because of the recent enhanced number of cases that we saw, especially in the
Right.
March-April period. A lot of people got understandably very worried when they saw the kind of visuals which were shown about people struggling for oxygen, etc. So that might have led to increased demand, but we should also leverage that to keep the momentum going to enhance our coverage across the board.
So do you think at any point door-to-door vaccination strategy might work, or is that something invisible?
It's certainly an option, and I think it should certainly be considered very seriously because that will help enhance outreach and enhance the number of people taking the vaccine. There is this concern that not everyone wants to, is able to come to a facility, and I think it's a fair concern. All of our national programs have worked well by virtue of having outreach happening through community-based vaccination, or our health professionals or health workers going to frontline areas and administering the
Right,
vaccine.
right.
The challenge here, I guess, is the concern about wanting to ensure that there is a waiting period of around at least 30 minutes for any immediate reactions post-vaccination, ensuring that you have systems in place to manage any kind of reactions which happen. Now, I think you can still do that, perhaps even at community level, by doing these kind of special outreach vaccination camp sequence where you do it maybe at an Anganwadi center or
Right.
at a village school, and then ensure that people are being followed up for the requisite period to ensure that there is no post reaction which is happening immediately, but also educating them about what to look out for and how to report, and ensuring that you have backup referral mechanisms available if someone has a serious reaction. So it will require some planning, but I think it should certainly help in enhancing our coverage of the vaccine because it is likely that there will be some section of the population which is not able to avail of facility-based vaccination if that is the only way we go.
Yes. Yes. And that might even, solve the access issue that we were talking about through the digital divide triggered access issue. So
It could certainly
yeah,
contribute to that.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Thank you. So I'm just going to veer to a slightly larger picture here. So I think some weeks back, we had scientists, in fact, many hundreds of scientists, writing to the PMO complaining of gaps in, and I quote here, systematic collection of epidemiological data as well as lack of systematic surveillance of coronavirus variants. And we even had a senior virologist step down yesterday from his chair of the INSACOG group. And that is also being interpreted in some quarters as a fallout of similar concerns, though he himself has not said so. But I mean, just going back to the terminology of the letter that scientists had written, could you explain what these gaps are in term, for the lay citizen? What do we mean when we say that there is no systematic surveillance or collection of epidemiological data? And what are the implications for the response to the pandemic?
Sure. So I think any good policy making, especially in the public health perspective, and even so during a pandemic, has to be essentially data driven, and by looking at what is the evidence on the ground. So what the kind of things you want to look at is where are the cases happening, what kind of cases are happening, how quickly are they happening, is there clustering happening, what is the patterns that you're starting to see, because that can help you respond quick enough. And if you respond quickly, there is a likelihood that you will prevent further spread, or at least decrease the rate at which it spreads. That's where epidemiology becomes important. Now, linked to that also is trying to track what kind of virus variants might be causing disease. Is there a new variant which is causing more number of infections? Where is it localized? What are the kind of features that you're seeing? So hence, you obviously need to link that to genomic surveillance as well, or genomic analysis as well. But that requires you to do good quality testing. That requires you to have that data readily available, analyzed, and it to be also that data to be authentic and communicated in a transparent manner. If you don't do enough testing, if you don't do enough lab-based analysis and genomic surveillance of an adequate number of samples, if you're not being honest and upfront about the data, or or you're hiding data, or perhaps not collecting enough data, then of course the information which will be available is going to be limited by that efficiency, and might mean that corrective steps, or steps which are in response to that data cannot be initiated. So hence, I think our experience, even pre-pandemic, tells us that these are areas where we need to build more capacity. We need better epidemiological expertise at the state level, at the national level, disease outbreak response. We need more human resources. We need more lab systems, and laboratory networks which have the expertise to be able to carry out these analysis. And then all that data needs to be analyzed and used for good quality policy making. So we could have learned from last year and perhaps done better for this year. I think some progress was certainly made. More labs were set up. Perhaps few states employed epidemiologists, or at least advertised for them. But a lot of that was also done short term. So posts which were advertised for 3 to 6 months, but then perhaps people were let go when the cases started declining.
Right.
Or you had labs set up, or you had temporary centers set up, but were they continued to be funded? Was it a one-time investment, or did you ensure that these labs are still up and running and can help contribute to a quick identification of a surge locally, etc.? I think those are the kind of questions we still don't have clarity about, and it's extremely important for us to work on these issues. So I think one of the lessons for all of us is that we need continued investment, but not just in infrastructure, but also in human resources and good quality data being available. In fact, not just on the testing in epidemiology, but also on the kind of treatments which are being used. What is the clinical experiences people are having? Is there a way of also doing some kind of sharing around what is the number of cases of a particular condition? For example, now there's a lot of a lot of worry around mucormycosis, the so-called black fungus. So are we having some kind of a registry nationally or at the state level, which tells us how many cases have happened both in the public sector and private sector? So states like Maharashtra, for example, talked about doing a registry of their own, but these are the kind of things we should have a national database on, so that we can know what is the kind of burden of that problem and very quickly try to address it.
So when it comes to data, do you feel that the problem is primarily in lack of collection, or that we do have the data somewhere and that it's just not transparent enough?
It's a mix of both things. I think sometimes data is not adequately collected, or it might be collected in a way that it might not be very useful. But sometimes data is also not communicated all the way to policymakers or to decision makers who can sort of use that data for quick decision making. Sometimes data might be collected on paper, but then it is, by the time it is actually translated and communicated to a senior level functionary sitting at the state level or the national level, it might take a lot of time, or there might be some loss of data, etc. So good quality systems which ensure that also you have check-ins, you ensure that the data which is coming through is authentic, and then act on it becomes important. So I think we certainly need more data to be collected, but data which is purposeful, just not data for the purpose of data. You can collect a lot of data which would be, in essence, useless as well. You need to only collect data which has implications from a public health or a decision-making perspective, but then also ensure that that data is collected correctly and communicated on.
For example, I think right now we all know about the undercounting or underreporting of death numbers. Okay, that has been a huge concern, and I mean, even if I set the obvious moral and ethical failing in that, even if I set that aside for the time being, what does such lack of data imply for response to the pandemic or for future waves? That is also something if you would like to weigh in on.
Yeah, I mean, again, anything where we are not able to catalog or collect adequate and correct information means that we are perhaps not being informed of the true burden of the disease. And that, of course, is of concern for all of us who are lay people, lay citizens. But it should be especially of concern to our policymakers, because a lot of decision making often depends on understanding the true nature of the burden and also understanding the kind of spread that you're seeing. So if you don't have that data which is represented in an accurate manner, then obviously your ability to decide and prioritize would be impacted negatively by that, or you make an inadequate decision based on data which is not entirely correct. So hence, all the more reason why we should be doing better data collection as well as analysis and using that to inform our response.
So there were also concerns, although I see a waning in that, perhaps because of, of the rush to get vaccines. But there were concerns about the availability of data from trials on vaccines, about their proven efficacy, etc. At this juncture, as we stand now, if you look at the three vaccines which are in use or have been approved, like including Sputnik, how seriously do you rate these concerns about lack of data or proven efficacy? I mean, if when there is a pressure, is there also a fear that we may be hurrying things on the front of checking for immunogenicity data, etc.? And how do we know that there is enough due diligence being done? Is there enough transparency on that?
Yeah, so we have standard systems at the regulatory level which are supposed to respond to all of these issues, which is to look at the data, and the regulator has to have an important role, and that role is to provide oversight around clinical studies which are happening, around the way drug development or vaccine development is happening, and then the way drugs or vaccines or any other medical intervention is rolled out, which has a regulatory angle to it. The problem we've seen is that just even from last year, a lot of times decisions have been taken, but not very, communicated in terms of what was the background rationale or supportive evidence behind those decisions. And even when decisions were taken, it's been a while since those decisions were taken, and we still haven't seen that data. So, bridging data or efficacy data from phase 3 studies not yet in the public domain, not yet published. If there is a new vaccine from a foreign country coming in, then is there adequate data? Where was that data collected? Where was it published? Have concerns which have been expressed by, say, other regulators been taken into account or not? I think there are a lot of question marks on all of these, and that should worry us, because while it's extremely important for us to enhance our vaccination coverage, we also need to do it in a way where we have confidence about vaccines being used. And the data so far actually is fairly supportive of these vaccines being largely safe, because vaccines have been used now in millions of people. But that having been said, there is always the small chance of adverse events being missed, and that should not be happening, because we need to know, what are the kind of adverse event profiles these vaccines have. Similarly, efficacy. What do the studies indicate? What is the real world effectiveness that we are seeing? How are we analyzing it? Who's keeping track of all of these? Are we taking into account concerns expressed by other groups, either scientists or drug regulators in other countries who have also looked at those data sets? And whenever we make a decision, also ensuring that that is backed up by a detailed explanation of why those choices were made and on the basis of which data. If you just have one or two lines of description of approval or disapproval, or it doesn't tell you a lot. And I think at this point of time, it would really help to have more transparency and more backup information around decision making being available.
So I'll just have one last question for you. And I mean, without beating around the bush too much, we are not in a very ideal situation, and we see ourselves in quite a deep mess at present. What do you think should be the immediate steps that both governments as well as the people should follow to come out of this and prevent a recurrence of this intensity? I mean, what have been the main lessons from this second wave, according to you?
Yeah, so I think a few things. One is the short-term response is certainly contingent on what the issues are, where there is a major challenge, especially from a critical care perspective. So if oxygen is a concern, then obviously there is, you can't be doing long-term planning. It has to be something you do immediately, because that could save lives. And I think now we are certainly better at it, because we have probably more oxygen being produced domestically, as well as more oxygen available either by import, etc. We have more oxygen concentrators, etc. available. There are concerns around access or availability of drugs, certain drugs. For example, now for mucormycosis, there seems to be a fair bit of a shortage. So these are the kind of things we need to be on top of and very quickly try to address, because otherwise it leads to panic, it leads to black marketing, it leads to a situation where families are running around trying to access drugs without these being available. And obviously that is not the kind of a situation you want to put people into. The second linked issue to that is evidence-based medical practice and decision-making. So the fact that convalescent plasma usage, for example, has been continued to be used now for many months, even in the absence of any data which shows that it has a benefit, including from studies done in India and by ICMR, is a cause for concern, because that is the kind of thing you want to avoid. You should be focusing on what we know works and then doing that well, rather than going into areas where there is no evidence, and perhaps that being a wastage of resources and a lot of families coming to grief unnecessarily about not being able to source plasma, etc. The third thing we need to
just discontinued that, but
we finally just did this week, yeah. But the evidence was not true, and the evidence for that was not there for a long time. It's not like that's new evidence now. This is studies which have been done for a long time, including in India, as we discussed, and published last year itself.
Right.
The third thing is then, what do we learn from both last year's experience, which perhaps we did not pay enough heed to, but now substantiated by this year? And that clearly tells us that there is a need to do more investment in social sectors like health. You need to have more GDP expenditure. You need to spend whatever you are spending well. You need to be doing more efficiency, building that into the system. You need more facilities, but you also need primary healthcare reform so that more and more early level management and prevention and promotion can happen at the primary and secondary care level. We need to ensure that there are adequate staff available in the public sector across the board. We need to create enough posts for specialized departments such as epidemiology, etc. And we need to do this fast. So I think if we do it well, then we will also be in a situation where there is resilience in the health system. There is, learning from best practices which have been done, say in Kerala, say in Mumbai, say in the Northeast. So we learn from that and we adapt that or scale that up across the health system. But we also ensure that we have enough capacity within the health system to be able to manage, say, a future rise in either COVID-19 or a future pandemic or a situation like this, which is almost like a disaster of a kind for the health system. But yet also being able to cater to the needs which might not be related immediately to, say, COVID. One of the problems right now and also last year is the fact that almost everything has become COVID. But what about those who have non-COVID conditions? If I have a dialysis requirement, if I have cancer care requirement, if I have a surgery requirement, am I able to offer services in the same way that they should be getting? Probably not, and that also should worry us, because the downstream impact on some of these non-COVID conditions could also be pretty bad, given that there's been so much focus, and almost entire hospitals, including tertiary care institutions, have been converted to COVID care institutions. So a lot of downstream impact could be there on, say, TB, or on, say, malaria, on, say, other infectious and non-communicable diseases. So we need to also think through that and ensure that while we focus on, say, a response to a immediate crisis like a pandemic, we are also able to cater to the needs of those who might not be related to that particular disease condition. So in summary, that is extremely important, but this is only going to happen if you, me, all of us keep that pressure onto our policymakers, ensure that health becomes also a political requirement. If you fight an election, you have to fight that also on what are you going to do better next time? How are you going to rebuild the health system to be stronger? And how are you going to invest in that? How are you going to prioritize that and have a clear time map and deliverables against that? And all of us should expect that of our policymakers, our politicians, and ensure that they stick to that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhan. That was a very engaging discussion. Thank you for being here today, and we will be in touch with you.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be there.